and listening effectively. However, we don't get any training in how to listen. We're taught how to read. We have classes in speaking skills and writing skills. But how many people have had any formal training when it comes to listening? Very, very few. We take it for granted. We think that everyone can listen. I'm a good listener. One of the number one characteristic or qualification that employers are looking for, and by the way, saying that they're not getting in recent college graduates, listening skills that we are producing, and that's not just Somerset Community College, but colleges across the country. We are producing graduates that don't listen effectively, have not developed those listening skills. So what's going on? What's happening? If that's what they're looking for, and what they keep telling us is, you're doing a fantastic job teaching them the technical skills. They can run the software, they can run the equipment, they can do this, but their listening skills are horrible. So what's going on? What's happening? I think part of the problem is that we confuse listening and hearing. Listening and hearing. What's the difference between the two?
Hearing is actually just what's going on inside your ear. You can pick up pitches, sounds, volume, frequencies, all that. But listening, you're taking that and you're comprehending what's being said. Comprehension.
Give me another word for taking it in. You said hearing, you're just taking it in. What's the book used? Do you remember? Receiving. Yeah. The hearing is a biological function. Let's put physiological. That sounds better. A physiological function. It's very passive. It just happens. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to be involved in any process to hear. If you're born with everything working properly, you don't get sick, you don't get a fever, you don't have an injury, you can hear. Everybody can hear. It's a physiological function. And it does just stop at the receiving part of the process. That's it. That's really all that's involved with hearing, is picking up that aural stimuli. We can hear. It's very passive. It just happens. Listening, on the other hand, is a skill. Okay, now, we throw that word around an awful lot. I've used it several times in the last couple of chapters, talking about different communication skills. What does that mean? Well, if something's a skill, that means that we have to learn it. We have to develop it. It has to be taught to us. We learn how to listen. So what kind of listening training did you get? Be quiet, listen to me. I'm talking now. We don't get any formal training when it comes to listening. We're told what not to do. We're told to listen, but we're really not given any formal training when it comes to listening. We learn to listen. It is a skill. And like any skill, it can be sharpened, it can be strengthened. You all are probably very, very good listeners. Although it didn't show up on that quiz we just took. You're probably pretty good listeners. But the best listeners in the world can still get better. It's like a muscle. They can sharpen and strengthen those skills, make them more effective. You all have muscle. You don't have guns like these, but you all have muscles. You can make that muscle stronger and more effective. Same thing with your listening skills. So no matter how good a listener you are now, hopefully as we go through this chapter and we talk about the different listening behaviors and we talk about things that get in the way of effective listening, you'll be able to sharpen those skills. So listening is a skill. It has to be learned, it has to be taught, and it's an active process. And I'm going to underline the word active because it's key. You do have to decide to listen. You have to involve yourself in the listening process. It is very, very active. It doesn't just happen. So hearing is passive, listening is very active. Okay, now I'm going to give you a heads up for your notes, and we'll start right off the bat with this so that they'll be clear. There are 3 lists of 5 in this chapter. There are the 5 steps in the listening process. 5 steps in the listening process, the 5 types of listening, and the 5 reasons or purposes for listening. So I want to get those 3 lists of 5 right off the bat today, taken care of today, so they're real clear in your notes. My concern is I don't want you to mix them up when you take the test, because they will be on the test. We're going to start with the 5 steps in the listening process. Then we'll have the 5 types of listening, and then we will have the 5 purposes or reasons for listening. So make sure they're clear in your notes which one we're doing, which one we're talking about. Now you might notice we didn't really start out with a definition of listening. Your book really doesn't give a clear definition. It kind of describes listening as an active process of receiving, understanding, evaluating, remembering, and responding to, and this, here's what I'm going to change up something. In the book, they say that listening is an active process of receiving, understanding, evaluating, remembering, and responding to oral stimuli. And I want you to know that term, oral stimuli. What does oral mean? A-U-R-A-L. What does that mean? What kind of stimulus would oral stimuli be? Any guesses? We're just talking about sounds. Oral means sounds. And I don't like that. I don't think that that's a very accurate description of what's taking place in the listening process. Oral stimuli means sounds. People are talking and we're receiving that, we're understanding that, we're processing, evaluating that. I think very good listeners respond to the oral stimuli, but they respond to both verbal and nonverbal stimuli. If you're a good listener, and you think about the people that you know that are good listeners, easy to talk to, you love to get together with them and just talk, have conversation, they're good listeners. They don't just listen to the words. They consider the context. They consider the nonverbals as well. The tone of your voice, how you're sitting, your facial expressions, what came before, what came after. A good listener considers both the verbal and the nonverbal stimuli. So we just killed 2 birds with 1 stone. We described listening, what takes place in the listening process, and we've listed the 5 steps or stages in the listening process. Here they are. 1, 2, 3, did I get them all? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So under 5 steps or stages in the listening process, You want to have your first list of 5, receiving, understanding, evaluating, remembering, and responding are the 5 steps or stages in the listening process. We good? The second list of 5 that we're going to talk about is not in your book. It will absolutely positively be on the chapter test, and it will be on the final. So what I'm saying is get this in your notes. These are the 5 types of listening. Now, when I was in grad school, we took a course on listening. We had to memorize, we had to know these 5 types of listening, and we had to know them in the order that they occur. We couldn't just memorize the 5 types. We had to know the order in which they occur. So we used, what do they call that? A mnemonic device. Have you ever heard that term? Mnemonic device? Mnemonic device is something that helps you remember a list. So we developed a mnemonic device, or used a mnemonic device, found a mnemonic device to help us remember the 5 types of listening. We drew out the list in the shape of a tree, the listening tree, we called it all the time, to help us remember the order in which they occur. Now you don't have to, I'm not going to ask you to draw a tree on the exam, on the chapter test or on the final, but you do need to know these and the order that they occur. So because I'm a creature of habit, I'm going to put them in the shape of a tree. You don't have to know the tree. Before we listen any other way, first type of listening, before we listen any other way, I'm going to put it down here as the roots, we first have to listen discriminatively. Discriminative listening is the first type of listening. Before we listen any other way, we first have to listen discriminatively. Can you see that okay? Does that green show up okay? I can switch to a darker color if I need to. Before we listen any other way, we first have to listen discriminatively. And I've said that like 4 times. Great fill-in-the-blank question. Before we listen any other way, we first have to listen discriminatively. So what does that mean? Discriminative listening has to come first. By definition, by description, by nature, we have to first listen discriminatively before we listen any other way, because discriminative listening is when we make a decision to listen, when we choose to listen. Okay, he said this is going to be on the test. He said this isn't in the textbook. I better pay attention to this and get this in my notes. That's discriminative listening. This is when we start putting in some effort. This is when we involve ourselves in the listening process. Now, we've got the air conditioner going. That fan's blowing. In a minute, Roger's going to drive by on the lawnmower and go by the window. A discriminative listener is shutting all that out. You don't even really notice it because you're focusing on the information that you want to listen to. The verbal and nonverbal stimuli that you need to get a good grade on the course, in the course. You want to pass this test. You want to do a good job, so you're going to focus. You're tired. You've been working all night. You're dead tired, but you're going to stay awake because you know that this is on the test and it's on the final. You're listening discriminatively. That knucklehead sitting next to you keeps pestering you, keeps bothering you, and you're ignoring them. You're getting a text message and you're ignoring it. That's discriminative listening. Making the decision, making the effort to listen. Okay, so that's the roots of the tree. Discriminative listening. Now we're going to do the trunk of the tree, which is number 2, comprehensive listening. Comprehensive listening. That's the trunk of the tree. Has to come second. We first choose to listen, we listen discriminatively, and then we have to listen comprehensively. Doesn't matter what kind of listening you're doing, what's going on, what the context is, because you have to listen comprehensively. That's where we apply meaning and understanding to the message. Remember way back in chapter 1 we talked about decoding the message? That's what's going on in number 2. We're listening comprehensively. We're applying meaning and understanding to the message. We're applying meaning and understanding to the message. We're decoding the message. Now, if you're not getting it, this is where you raise your hand and you ask questions, or you move to the front, or whatever, so that you are able to apply meaning and understanding to the message. So that's number 2. Now we can go out into the branches of the tree, and these, it really doesn't matter. Once we get the first 2 out of the way, it really doesn't matter the order of these branches, but we'll put number 3 as therapeutic, or sometimes referred to as listening to help. Therapeutic or listening to help. Now we've listened discriminatively, we've applied meaning and understanding to what we're hearing, what we're listening to. Therapeutic listening is when someone's talking to you, they come to you, and you can tell they want advice. They want your opinion on something. They want you to suggest something. What do you think I should do? Man, I'm in a pickle. I got to do. And they want your opinion. They want your advice on something. That's one type of therapeutic listening. Is when you can tell they kind of want your advice. They kind of want your opinion. They want your help on something, a suggestion from you. The other type of therapeutic listening we call a sounding board. A sounding board. These are, and you've done this for friends, where you're just there so they can vent. They really don't want you to say anything. They don't want any kind of response from you, really. They just need someone to listen. Just someone to be there so they can vent. That would be therapeutic listening, listening to help. So any kind of counseling would be therapeutic listening. Support group, that would be therapeutic listening, listening to help. They want advice, want suggestions, or they just want you to be there so they can vent. Just be there as a sounding board. That would be therapeutic listening or listening to help. Okay, so let's branch off a little bit here. That was 3, so this would be 4. Critical or evaluative listening. Critical or evaluative listening. And either one is appropriate. It just depends on textbooks and professors who you're talking to. It's accepted either way, critical or evaluative. Critical or evaluative listening is when you're listening very closely, you're making a decision about what you're listening to. You're making a decision about what you're listening to. Is it good or bad? Do I like it or not? Is it right for me? Any kind of job interview, the person asking the questions, doing the interviewing, should be listening critically or evaluatively. If you're trying to decide if you're going to download a song and you're kind of listening to it in cue, listening to the little few seconds of it to see if you like it, if you're really listening to it to see if you like it, if you want to buy it, that would be critical or evaluative listening. In speech class, or any time when you're assigning a grade to someone, that would be critical or evaluative listening. I started to say in speech class, when students get up and give speeches and I evaluate them, give them a grade, that would be critical or evaluative listening. someone trying to sell you a car, sell you anything, and you're listening to them to see if this is going to be right for you, is this what I wanted, that would be critical or evaluative listening. Anytime you're making a choice or a decision about something, that would be critical or evaluative listening. So we've got 4 of them up there. What are we missing? What type of listening do we not have up here? You guys do this a lot, I'm sure. This type of listening. Probably did it in your car on the way here this morning. Any ideas what we're missing? How about for fun? Just for the heck of it. Listening to music, listening to the radio. So number 5 is sometimes called for fun, enjoyment, entertainment. Those are the most common terms I've seen for number 5. For fun, for enjoyment, for entertainment. Just listening to something for the heck of it, to relax. Listening to the radio on your way to school. Listening to a comedian on TV or whatever. Some people use those nature tapes, nature CDs to relax or whatever. That would be listening for enjoyment, for entertainment. Some people will do that with a good speaker or a good sermon, just to relax, just for the heck of it. Now, what's important about number 5, and you need to know for number 5, an important characteristic of listening for enjoyment or listening for entertainment is that of the 5 types of listening, it's the most passive. It doesn't take a whole lot of effort by definition. That's why you're doing it. You still have to involve yourself in the listening process, but it usually does not take a whole heck of a lot of work to listen for enjoyment. Of the 5 types of listening, listening for fun, for enjoyment, for entertainment is the most passive. It takes the least amount of effort. That's why you're doing it. Okay? We first have to listen discriminatively, then comprehensively, then we can branch on into the other 3. Make sure you have those in your notes and make sure you underline or highlight types. These are the steps, stages. Steps or stages in the listening process. These are the 5 types of listening. Underline that in your notes. Now the 5 purposes or reasons for listening. And I put purposes or reasons because they refer to them both ways, and I'm trying to remember as I was reviewing this, if they refer to them as purposes in the book and then reasons on the outline or the other way around. But at least in your chapter, they refer to them as purposes or reasons for listening. Why are we listening in the first place? What does listening accomplish? And these are pretty simple. The 5 types of reasons. 5 types of reasons for listening are to learn, to relate, in other words, to interact, to socialize, to learn, to relate, to influence or persuade, to learn, to relate, to influence, to play, for fun, for relate, to influence, to play, and to help, to assist. Those are the 5 types, or I'm sorry, the 5. I messed up myself. 5 purposes or reasons for listening. And I wanted to get those 3 lists of 5 in your notes right off the bat this morning so we don't get them mixed up, don't get them confused on the test. When you're taking the test, make sure you're putting the right list in when I ask you for the 5 steps or stages or the 5 types or the 5 purposes or reasons. And they may be different on the final. Maybe I'll only ask for these 2 on the chapter test and these 2, now I always ask for the types on it, or these 2 on the final. 5 types will probably be on both. So make sure you're putting the right list in. Okay. So we've got our 3 lists of 5. All right, let's start with, start in on, I'm not sure which I want to go to first. Let's go obstacles and barriers first. Obstacles and barriers to effective listening. This is the biggest list in the chapter. Once we get through this, it's downhill. These are the obstacles or barriers to effective listening. These are the things that get in the way. We talked about being a good listener, and that the people in this class are probably very good listeners. You have to be. You have to become a good listener to continue and to be successful in college. You have to develop those listening skills. Some of the skills that you develop, you don't even know you've developed them. It's a coping thing. You've done it to survive your classes, to pass and get through your classes. But these are things that get in the way typically and will cause problems for people as they try to listen effectively. These are bad habits, things that get in the way. The first is called preoccupation with self. Instead of being other-oriented in the conversation, in the relationship, this person is focused on their self. We would say they're self-centered in the relationship, in the conversation. They're so concerned about themselves that they're not listening to what the other person is saying. Preoccupation with self. They are self-centered. Usually someone that experiences this a lot, they're usually pretty competitive people. You experience, and I'm not saying that's a bad thing necessarily, but they like to perform well. And to the extreme, they might even see the conversation as a competition, that they've got to do well in this conversation. They're so concerned about their performance and what they're saying and getting a good one in that they're not listening to what the other person is saying. They're not other-oriented. They're not focused on the other person. They are being self-centered. And that's getting in the way of them listening to what the other person is saying. Now, a red flag, a characteristic. Remember, we've talked on and on about how you can't change other people's behaviors, but you can change your behavior. One of the red flags when it comes to preoccupation with self, one of the things to look for, characteristics of preoccupation with self, within yourself, to see if this is going on, it's called rehearsing your responses. This is a characteristic of preoccupation with self. Rehearsing your responses. We catch ourselves doing this. Rehearsing your responses means that instead of listening to what that other person is saying, you want to get a good zinger in. You want to get a good one in. So you're thinking about what you're going to say next. You're thinking about what your next comeback's going to be. You're going over in your head how you're going to get a good one in there. That's rehearsing your responses. The problem is that because you're doing that and focusing on that and your performance in the conversation, you're not listening to what the other person is saying. You're so focused on your response that you're not even listening to them. That's rehearsing your responses. You want to be other-oriented and focused on that other person. Be other-oriented. Number 2 sounds really impressive. The speech, thought, differential. The speech, thought differential. Now this is a barrier. This causes problems when we need to be listening and listening effectively. The speech thought differential sounds really impressive, but what it means is that our brains can process information, that's the thought part. Our brains can process information far quicker than any speaker can provide it. Our brains process information far quicker than any speaker can provide it. That's the speech thought differential. So the best speaker that you know, the best teacher you've ever had, the best preacher you have ever known, the best speaker that you know can't possibly provide enough information to keep your brain busy. So what happens? What does your brain do when it's not kept busy? Screensaver pop up?
It wanders.
It what?
Wanders.
Wanders. Where does it go?
Anywhere and everywhere.
Anywhere and everywhere. What do we call that? You're sitting here, I'm talking about the test coming up. Has that ever happened to you? You're sitting in class and the instructor's talking about reviewing for the test, going over the information, and all of a sudden you hear that instructor say, so don't forget that, make sure you have that in your notes, it'll definitely be on the test. And you're like, where have I been for the last 5 minutes? You didn't hear any of it. You didn't get, your mind wandered. What do we call that?
Spacing out.
Spacing out? What's the common term for it? You're what?
Daydreaming.
Daydreaming. That's what our brain does to keep itself busy. It does wander. You do space out. You start thinking about lunch, what you're going to do for lunch today, what you've got going on this afternoon, what you did this past weekend. Your brain is going to keep itself busy. That is normal. That's what it's supposed to do. Remember the movie Uncle Buck with John Candy? Have you ever seen that movie? Uncle Buck is kind of a bum, just kind of that black sheep of the family, and he's got to come and take care of his little niece and nephew while their parents go out of town. His sister goes out of town. And there's a part in that movie where the real little girl, she's in elementary school, gets in trouble at school. And Uncle Buck has to go talk to the vice principal, this witch of a lady. She's horrible. And he goes into her office, and this vice principal just going on and on. I think she calls his little niece a ninny or something like that because she keeps daydreaming in class. She's always daydreaming about the craziest things, imagination, always daydreaming. And she just goes on and on and on and start calling the little niece all kinds of names and everything. And Uncle Buck finally stops her dead in her tracks and with some pretty colorful language says, look, I wouldn't be worried about her because she's daydreaming. I'd be worried about the other kids if they're not daydreaming. And that's exactly right. That's true. Our brains, it doesn't mean there's something wrong with you if your brain is wandering, if your mind is wandering in class. It's keeping itself busy. So what do? How do we avoid the speech thought differential when you're in a horrible 4-week summer class that lasts for 2.5 hours or whatever it is to get material for the test? You've got to stay focused. What do? Well, your book's not real helpful. It says to stay in the here and now, to focus on the now. Well, that's easier said than done. Your brain's going to wander. People develop different techniques and different tricks to avoid the speech thought differential. When I was in grad school, one of the things that I would do, when you're in grad school, and it's still true, I think they've switched them up a little bit, but when I was in grad school, after you were done with all of your classes towards your degree, you were done with all of your coursework, you had to take a series of tests called your comps. You had to go in and take your comps. And you would go into the library, and I think mine started on a Friday. It might have been a Thursday. There were a couple of evenings and then all day on Saturday. And you have to show your ID, and you have to check in, and they take you into this little secluded room, and you take your comps. Well, your comps are made up of every class that you've had towards your degree. if you were there 2 years or 3 years, every single class that you took, every professor submitted, it was either 2 or 3 essay questions. So you had 2 or 3 essay questions from every class that you ever took. If you took it 3 years ago, you still had questions on your comps from that class. They were a bear, and you crammed and you studied for 2 weeks before you took your comps. You had to do it. So what I would do when I would go into class, started my first graduate class, I would, as I took notes, think, okay, by the end of this lecture, I'm going to come up with 3 questions that this bozo might ask me on my comps. Every lecture that I sat in, I would try to come up with 3 questions that he might ask on the comps. As I'm taking notes. Sounds kind of silly, but it kept me focused. It kept me focused on the lecture instead of daydreaming about other things. And it did help me with the comps. I would write down 3 questions. That helped. It kept me there. Now, we have convocation in the fall and again in the spring where we have to go to these meetings and listen to these speakers. Everybody at the college has to go over to the center. We have these presentations. And I do about the same thing in there. I will try to come up with 2 or 3 things that will help me. How can I use this in my job? And I'll come up with 2 or 3 things, and I'll try and list them. And sometimes it's pretty tough. Sometimes I'm struggling to get one. Come on, say something important. But it keeps me there. It keeps me focused on that information. Because I know when I get in leadership team meeting, my bosses are going to say, well, what did you think when they said this? Or what did you think about that meeting or that speaker? So people come up with different tricks. Some people will doodle. I'm looking to see if anyone, while they're listening to someone speak, they're drawing all kinds of pictures and they'll get these real elaborate doodles in there. Some people, note-taking helps them avoid the speech-thought differential. If they can take good notes, that doesn't work with me. I've got to have some kind of trick or some technique other than just taking notes, or I find myself, my notes don't make any sense at all to me. That doesn't help me with the speech-thought differential. Some people doodle, some people record the information, a lot of different techniques to avoid the speech-thought differential. It's up to you. What works for you? What keeps you in the here and now? Trying to apply the topic to your life, to what you do at work or to your family. People have different techniques to avoid the speech-thought differential. It's daydreaming. Your brain processes information far quicker than any speaker can provide it. So your brain is going to keep itself busy by day. It doesn't just shut down. It's going to daydream. It's going to wander to keep itself busy. So we have to develop techniques that work for us to avoid the speech-thought differential. What are we on? Number 3. Can you help me out a little bit? Say the word spot 5 times, loud and fast.
Spot, 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 spot.
A little bit louder so they can hear you back there.
Spot, 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 spot.
You're driving in your car, get to the intersection, green light, what do?
Spot.
Spot?
Stop.
Stop? What happened?
Integrate.
You're driving in your car, get to an intersection, green light, what do?
Go through it.
Go, right? Don't you go? Okay, I'll give you a chance to redeem yourself. Say silk 5 times fast.
Silk, 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 silk.
What did cows drink?
No.
Milk. So when I go home today and I drive by those beautiful pastures and I see those big steel tubs out there, they're full of milk. Cows drink water, don't they? Sure. What just happened? What just happened? It's called hearing what we expect to hear. Well, he thinks he's going to trick me. I'll show him. And we predict. That's all that we're talking about. Hearing what we expect to hear is number 3. We predict what the speaker is going to say. You don't really listen. You don't stop at a green light. I know that. But you're predicting. You're kind of one step ahead of me. So you're not really listening to what I'm saying. You're hearing what we expect to hear. Jacqueline and I worked that out before class. Hearing what we expect to hear, predicting what the person is going to say. They use it in commercials all the time. A couple of Super Bowls ago, there was a commercial, was it for Slim Fast or something like that, where the guy's reading the newspaper at the table, and a kiss of death, when wife asks you this, she comes out and says, "Do these jeans make me look fat?" And he's reading the paper, not even and he says, "You betcha," or something like that, you know, not even listening to what she said, and she gets all mad. That's what we're talking about with number 3, hearing what you expect to hear. People, we expect them to follow a script. We're really not listening to what they're actually saying. We're hearing what we expect them to say.
I do that a lot with my kids because they're always fighting.
And they
back
look at you
forth.
like you're nuts, don't they?
And I will fuss at them because what I thought they said is not what they actually
Right.
said, and they're responding like, "Huh."
What are you talking about?
Yeah.
Like you're crazy. When Mitchell, our oldest son, was real little, I had to stop by. I was running around town, had to stop by the grocery store, get something for Paula. They were with me, he and his cousin, probably 8 years old. You know how kids are in the grocery store, and they were just stressing me out, going crazy. And we're going through the checkout line. And the kids are fussing and everything. And I go through the checkout line, and the checker says to me, this, you guys might not remember this, but he said to me, "Paper or plastic? Do you want a paper bag or do you want a plastic bag?" "Paper or plastic?" I said, "Fine, fine, how are you?" And the boys looked at me like, they just started laughing. The checker looked at me like I was on drugs. But he didn't follow the script. He's supposed to ask me how I'm doing and then ask me if I want paper or plastic. That's hearing what we expect to hear. You walk by that person's desk every day, they say the same thing to you every day. We really don't listen to what they're saying. Have you ever walked by someone and said good morning to them and they say, "Fine, I'm fine, how are you?" And I didn't ask you how you were doing, but that's what they expected you to say. We miss a lot when we don't really focus, when we don't listen, we predict. It's kind of lazy listening, predicting what the person is going to say, instead of actually focusing on what they are saying. Number 4, these are barriers, these are bad habits. Offensive listening. Offensive listening. In football, what's the objective of the offense? What's the offense supposed to do?
Stop the ball.
It's supposed to what?
Or score.
Score points, right? That's what the offense is supposed to do. That's the object of the offense. That's what they're designed to do. Offensive listeners are a lot the same way. And you probably know these people. Offensive listeners, they're like vultures sitting in a tree, or sharks circling around you. They're listening, but they're listening to hear you make a mistake. They cannot wait until you mispronounce a word, or you use poor grammar, or you say something incorrect, and they have to make a big show out of it. They've got to correct you. They're showing everyone how smart they are by putting you down. That's an offensive listener. They're really not listening. They know what you meant. They're really not listening to what you're saying. They're waiting for you to make a mistake, mispronounce a word, or use poor grammar, and then they've got to really show off, make a big deal out of it by correcting you. Now, some people that are really bad offensive listeners take this to the extreme. They'll correct you, and they'll be wrong. They're trying to show everyone how smart they are, and they're wrong in their correcting of you. That's pretty extreme offensive listeners. They're like vultures sitting in a tree, just waiting for you to make a mistake. And it's all about motivation. You know, some teachers, maybe your parents or a coach or whatever, will correct you to help you out. Their motivation is positive. They want you to improve. They're trying to help, not the offensive listener. The offensive listener is trying to build themselves up by putting you down. It's all about motivation. They want to look smarter than you, and they do that by correcting you, making a big show of it. That's offensive listening, like vultures, just waiting for you to make a mistake. Number 5 is called friend or foe fallacy. Some textbooks refer to this as the friend or foe factor. Friend or foe fallacy or friend or foe factor. What's a foe? F-O-E.
An opposing person, somebody that opposes your.
All right, someone that opposes your point of view.
I say enemy.
Enemy, that's a foe. Good word, enemy. Someone that opposes you, your opinion, whatever. That's a foe. What's a fallacy?
Logical reasoning.
Yeah, it's illogical reasoning. It's something that we think is true, but it really isn't. We may believe that it's true, but it really isn't. The friend or foe fallacy happens all the time. Happens to all of us, I think. The friend or foe fallacy is that we listen better, but let's use effectively. We listen more effectively to people we like, people we agree with, people that agree with us, our friends. We listen more effectively to them. Now remember, that's the fallacy. And I've had professors in college that preach that you listen more effectively to people that agree with you, people that you like, people that you like. In fact, I had one professor that said in class that we listen more effectively to people that are similar to us. Now think about that. We listen more effectively to people that are similar to us. So that means if you go into, if that's true, that means you go into a college class and that instructor, that professor, is from another culture, has a different accent than you do, was raised differently than you are. You're not going to listen effectively to that person. Can you see where that would be an issue, a problem for an effective listener? Because if that part is true, that we listen effectively to people that we like, people that we're friendly with, people that are similar to us, then the opposite of that, or not the opposite, but the other part of that must be true as well, that we don't listen effectively to people that are different than we are, that we disagree with. That can cause some real issues. You're going to have teachers that are very, very different than you are, that come from very different backgrounds. You're going to have bosses that come from different backgrounds, different cultures. You have to, as an effective listener, be able to listen effectively to everyone, whether they're similar to you, whether they agree with you or not. You are going to have to listen effectively to everyone. Now, part of the friend or foe factor says that if you like them, if you agree with them, you give them the benefit of the doubt all the time. Well, what they really meant to say, I know what they meant. That you make excuses for them if you like them. If you don't like them, they can't say anything right. If you disagree with them, you'll find something wrong with everything that they say. Now let's use an extreme example. I'm trying to think of someone that's gotten in trouble recently. We'll just use Rush Limbaugh because he's easy. Rush Limbaugh, Hillary Clinton could say good morning, and Rush Limbaugh is going to find something wrong with it, right? Because they're on different ends of the political spectrum what their beliefs are. That would be a result of the friend or foe factor. Because I don't like them, because I don't agree with them, they can't say anything right. Rush Limbaugh, I'm trying to think of someone that he does like. He didn't get along with George Bush very well. I'm trying to think of someone that he does look up to or respect. Maybe Ronald Reagan, and he's been fairly critical of Ronald Reagan too. But if we flip that around, Ronald Reagan could say no wrong, because they agree with him, because we're similar in our beliefs. Can you see where that would be a problem? As effective communicators, we need to listen well We need to listen effectively to everyone, whether they're similar to us or not. In fact, if there's any truth to this friend or foe factor, the really good listeners that I know, the really effective listeners that I know, it almost flips this around. That if they're in a situation with someone that comes from a completely different culture, has a completely different background, boy, they really zero in on that. They love that. It's an opportunity to learn, to hear new ideas, to hear new things. So they really focus and listen very effectively to people that are different than they are. Friend or foe fallacy. We should listen effectively to everyone, whether they agree with us or not, whether they're similar to us or not. Listening effectively, being polite, being courteous, being respectful, does not mean that you agree with what they believe in. You're still going to benefit from listening and trying to understand, processing what they're saying. Remember, this is the barrier. This is the obstacle. I tried to figure out a way to word this one after reading your chapter, and I'm just going to call it early judgment. Your book says premature evaluations or something. It says to postpone judgment as long as you possibly can. Delay evaluation or postpone judgment as long as you possibly can. Give the person a chance. Making early judgments, I'm not going to get anything out of this. Look at that clown. He's not going to tell me anything. We make early judgments and we tune out. We don't listen effectively. Your book is saying to postpone judgment as long as you possibly can, to delay evaluation as long as you possibly can. Give the person a chance. Now, notice that they're not saying don't judge or don't evaluate. We will. I mean, we're human. We have our preferences. We have our own prejudices and biases, things that we like, things that we prefer. We're going to make judgment. What the book is saying is to put it off as long as you possibly